to Search the Scriptures. We are on study number 5 today in the book of 1 Kings, and this study covers 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7 and verse 12. Now, in this portion of Scripture, it talks about the building of the temple that Solomon built, that his father David had designed, as well as the building of the palaces of Solomon. Now, normally I would read this scripture and then we would get to the questions, but I'm going to do a little bit differently today because it'd be a little bit redundant the way that the questions are phrased, and so it'll be like reading the passage twice. So converted some of the measurements and different things. So rather than read the passage, we'll just answer the questions. Question 1, what was the temple's length, breadth, and height? And what was the size of the porch? And what of the most holy place, here called the inner sanctuary? Well, the temple was a project that took Solomon 7 years to build. We have to remember that it was designed by David, and then Solomon, a very detailed design by David, and then Solomon came along and followed that design. We're told that David did this in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 and verse 5. He knew Solomon was an awful young guy and wouldn't really know how to go about doing everything exactly as it needed to be done. So David took the time to design the temple. Now, when it talks about the temple here, it's not talking about the temple that we think of as when Jesus was here. That was Herod's temple. Herod's temple had a huge court of the Gentiles, huge porches around it, much bigger building. This temple is merely referring to the structure that Solomon built that housed the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The altar, the big bronze altar, was not in this building. This building is made up of basically 2 rooms. The holy place, where there was the table that had the bread on it and the candlestick, and the Holy of Holies for the Ark of the Covenant, altar of incense. So the building that he built that this is talking about here is 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. So if you take something, it kind of looked like a semi-trailer, and you multiplied it by 3 wide and 3 high and 3 long. That's kind of more or less what the dimensions of this building would look like. Very narrow, taller than it was wide, and 3 times as long as it was wide as well. 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, 45 feet high. The porch or the portico at the front was an additional 15 feet stuck onto it, so total length from one end to the other would have been 105 feet. And that's without any of the rooms around the outside edges, around the 2 sides and around the back. There were rooms, 3 different floors, and these 3 floors added up together would have been about 7.5 feet short of the top of the actual structure of the rest of the temple. And these floors, the first floor is 7.5 feet, the next floor wider, 9 feet, the next floor even wider, 10 feet. So they would have hung over 1.5 feet from one floor to the next floor. And this was so that holes wouldn't have to be put in the walls for the floor of the next structure. So the ceiling of the lower floor and the floor of the second floor were built on top of the walls of the first floor. But it didn't look like a cantilevered building from the outside because it was all dressed evenly on the outside. So you couldn't really tell until you were actually in the rooms that they were of differing sizes. The floors of all the outer chambers, the roofs of the entire structure, all made out of cedar beams and cedar planks on the ceilings, pine planks on the floors covered with pure gold, and the cedar planks were carved with images of palm trees and open flowers. So you can imagine what this building would have smelled like if you've ever smelled the inside of a cedar chest. It's a giant 90 foot by 30 foot by 45 foot cedar chest, and would have had that smell going throughout the building. All of the stone that was used was dressed outside of the camp. You couldn't hear the sound of chisels or anything like that outside the camp, outside of where the temple was built. It was all done at the quarry, prefabricated, then brought into the building site and placed 3 courses of stone wide And from the inside of the temple, you could not see any of the stone. It would have been all covered with the cedar planks. The Holy of Holies, the farthest room in, was 15 foot shorter in height than the rest of the building, but it was basically a cube, 30 feet wide, 30 feet tall, and 30 feet deep. All of the walls, floor, everything gold. You walked into this room, it was just pure gold everywhere that you looked. You could see nothing else but gold. Two 15-foot cherubim or angels with their wings outstretched and touching tip to tip, and the other wing touching the wall, were in that room, standing over, guarding really the Ark of the Covenant. The holy place, the first room you entered, was 60 feet deep, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. We're also told of some other buildings. Not sure if these are 5 different buildings, 4 different buildings. Not really sure how this works out. But we're told the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon took 13 years to build. The Temple 7, this building took 13 years. It was 60 feet longer, it was 150 feet wide. It was 45 long, 150. It was 45 feet wider than the temple, is 75 feet wide. It was the same height as the temple, 45 feet. The throne hall and the Palace of Justice may have been in this building called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. It's kind of unclear whether it was or not. Then there was the palace in which Solomon lived, and the palace for the daughter of Pharaoh whom Solomon had married. So once again, not sure exactly how many buildings this was. Also, just kind of go back to the temple for a moment. You have these rooms, 7.5 feet, 9 feet, 10 feet wide on the outside and around the back and on the sides. They only went up, though, about 22 and a half feet. So above that, another few feet there, you had room for windows, and that's how light would get into the 2 inner rooms of the temple. Question 5, of what material were the walls made? With what were they lined on the inside? How were they adorned? And observe all the care expended on the design and workmanship of the 2 sets of doors, and what can we learn from these things? Well, the walls were, as I said, made of 3 courses of stone covered with cedar. Cedar panels had palm trees, open flowers carved on them. You could not see any stone whatsoever from the inside of the temple. There were 2 sets of doors, the main doors going into the holy place, and then the inner doors at the Holy of Holies. Both sets of doors had carved cherubim on them, which are angels, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and then they were overlain with pure gold. The doors to the Holy of Holies, which is that inner room, that cubed room, all gold on the inside, were made out of olive wood. The doors to the holy place were made out of pine. As significant as this structure was, and as credible as its foundation stones, and there would have been no building like this at that time, it was unequaled, the true foundation on which it stood wasn't those stones dressed in that quarry and hauled in. The true foundation was obedience to God. God had made a promise to Solomon. The promise was this. It's in chapter 6. As for this temple that you are building, if you follow my decrees and you carry out my regulations and you keep all my commands and you obey them, that's a big if. If you do that, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites, and I will not abandon my people Israel. 1 Kings 6:12 through 13. Now, as we know, Solomon's temple was destroyed. It's rebuilt in the days of Nehemiah. The church is not stone, it's not mortar, it's not lumber. It's a spiritual house, and its foundation has to be Christ. If our foundation isn't Christ, if our foundation isn't obedience to Christ, we have no right to demand that God fulfill the promises of His Word. He fulfills those promises to those upon whom build their foundation on Jesus Christ. Build on anything less than Christ, and you can be assured destruction. If your life's falling apart right now, I just ask, is it built on being obedient to the Lord? Those things that are falling down around you, is it because you are obedient to the Lord? Or is it because you are disobedient? I'd encourage you to build on obedience to Christ and His Word, and a place like Search the Scriptures is a great place to start. Hope you're having a great day so far. Hope this study's been a blessing to you. May God richly bless the rest of your day.